Alright, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today is November 1st, 2019, and I wanted to continue the conversation on Andrew Yang and the war on normal people. So today I'm going to break into chapter 2, titled How We Got Here. So chapter 2 is a very data-driven chapter. It really highlights how we got to the point that we are now, as far as from the early 19th century to where we are now, how we arrived at this point. And it really breaks down into the numbers and figures. So I took the liberty of highlighting stuff that I find to be important. So I'm just kind of go over that and take you guys down that path. So he talks about in the beginning, in the 1970s, how his parents worked for GE and Blue Cross Blue Shield in upstate New York, and generous pensions were expected for them to stay for decades. Community banks lent money to local companies for a modest return, and over 20% of workers were unionized. Now, just to fast forward today, obviously none of this is the case today. Very few companies offer generous pensions. Community banks really don't exist anymore, and the banks that exist are really huge banks, and they don't necessarily invest in a modest way. And 20% of workers were unionized. That number has dropped considerably. So today, 5 banks control 50% of the commercial banking industry, which itself mushroomed to the point where finance enjoys about 25% of all corporate profits. So think about that for a second. Finance enjoys about 25% of all corporate profits. So out of all the $1 billion that are earned in all these tech companies and Ford and GE and all these companies, about 25% of profits are earned through finance, through investment banking, through banks taking your money and investing it on Wall Street and the stock market and taking risky investments and earning money. That's how they're able to generate such a high return. Also important to note, union membership fell by 50%. 94% of the jobs created between 2005 and 2015 were temp or contractor jobs without benefits. This resulted in people working multiple jobs to make ends meet, was becoming increasingly the norm. Now this, I think, is a, you could describe 2005 to 2015, well, not 2005, but Obama got elected in 2008, right? So most of that is largely the Obama economy, and you have to remember that we were coming out of a recession. Obama did pull us out of the recession, but a lot of the jobs that were added to the economy, unfortunately, were temporary or contractor jobs without benefits, or they were part-time employment where companies didn't have to pay benefits. So it was a big difference between the jobs that used to exist in the early 19th century compared to a lot of the jobs that we have now. Largely, I think, because of the shrink on the demand for labor and the ability to sort of outsource work, which he further goes into during the book. But I think that part was important, because I think this part right here is largely one of the main reasons that Trump got elected, is because a lot of people felt like that, like the jobs weren't really good enough and they weren't doing enough. And the whole slogan behind Trump's campaign to make America great again, I think sort of kind of takes you back to a time where things were a little bit better, where American could get a job in a factory, make a good, decent living, get benefits, and retire and take care of their family. It continues to say, real wages have been flat or even declining. The chances that an American born in 1990 will earn more than their parents are down to 50%. For Americans born in 1940, the same figure was 92%. So think about that. If you were born in the 1990s, which I am, there's a 50% chance that I'll earn more or have a better standard of life than my parents. Whereas in 1940, if you were an American born in the 1940s, you had a 92% chance of doing better than your parents, which honestly is the way it's supposed to be. It continues to talk about key figures like Milton Friedman, Jack Welch, and their role they played on changing the culture of business in the 1970s and 80s. Companies really started to shift in a sense of companies really began trying to maximize profits and solely looking out for their shareholders and the bottom line. Part of the philosophy that these guys had was a company's sole job was to make money. And also, CEOs were granted stock options for the first time that wedded their individual gain to the company's share price. So as a result, the ratio of CEO to worker pay rose from 20 to 1 in 1965 to 271 to 1 in 2016. So in 1965, you were, as a CEO, making about 20 times what an employee makes in your company. Whereas in 2016, you're making 271 times what an employee makes. Okay. It continues to say regulations separating consumer lending and investment banking were abolished. Financial deregulation started under Ronald Reagan in 1980 and culminated in the Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999 under Bill Clinton that really set the banks loose. So after this deregulation movement and Financial Modernization Act, American companies realized they could outsource manufacturing, information technology, and customer service to Chinese and Mexican factories and Indian programmers and call centers. U.S. companies outsourced and offshored 14 million jobs by 2013. Now, this resulted in lower prices, higher efficiencies, and some new opportunities, but also increased pressures on American workers who now had to compete with a global labor pool. So this is really in the 1990s, or really the 1980s is really when the push towards globalization really started to happen. Automation started out on farms earlier in the century with tractors and then migrated to factories in the 1970s. Manufacturing employment began to slip around 1978 as wage growth began to fall. Median wages used to go up in lockstep with productivity and GDP growth before diverging sharply in the 1970s. Since 1973, productivity has skyrocketed relative to the hourly compensation of the average wage earner. So that part's really important. GDP growth and wages used to be pretty much in lockstep. So pretty much the amount of productivity that we had as a country as a whole was pretty much reflective on how much individual workers were being paid. So I think that's what people mean when they say, make America great again and the good days. And this is a chart from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. As you can see, I don't know if you guys can see that, but that gray is actually the compensation, and that black line there is actually productivity. As you can see, they start to, compensation goes up slightly, but productivity actually spikes pretty dramatically between 1949 and 2017. The share of GDP going to wages has fallen from almost 54% in 1970 to 44% in 2013. Being a shareholder has been great for your bottom line. Being a worker, not so much. The top 1% have accrued 52% of the real income growth in America since 2009. Technology is a big part of this story as it tends to lead to a small handful of winners. Studies have shown that everyone is less happy in an unequal society, even those at the top. So that's interesting. Everybody in a unequal society, studies would point to being less happy. And I've always kind of felt that is the case. I think this is a reason that we have a lot of the problems that we have in today's society is because the wealth gap is so extreme, because you have so many people who are doing beyond well, and then you have so many people who are not doing good at all. I think it really plays on the consciousness of people in a very negative way. And then you combine that with the fact that we have this big shift in technology where everything is changing so fast, and as we know, most human beings are, they don't really like change too much. So everything is changing so much, and there's the perception that it's changing for the bad. Even if it may not necessarily be changing for the bad, there is that perception, and human beings naturally don't care for change. And I think that's the reason that we have, my opinion, the reason that we have a lot of the shootings that we have a lot of the problems as far as depressions and anxiety and epidemics of heroin users and things like that. I think it really does have a lot to do with the state of the economy in a weird way. Jobs don't grow like they used to. Companies can now prosper, grow, mint record profits without hiring many people or increasing wages. Both job creation and wage growth have been weaker than the top line economic growth would suggest since the 1970s. In each of the last several decades, the economy has created a lower percentage of new jobs, including no new net jobs between 2000 and 2010 due to the Great Recession. The companies of the future simply don't need as many people as the companies of earlier eras, and more of their employees have specialized skills. So this is a chart that he put in the book, and it shows pretty much Amazon, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Snap, Airbnb, all the companies, the big companies of today versus, sort of the big companies of the past years: Walmart, GM, AT&T, IBM, GE, Kodak, Hilton. And as you can see, the numbers are pretty clear. You need a lot less employees for this new age company to succeed and make record profits than you did in the past. There's a lot less demand for human labor, and what is more in demand is specialized skills. MIT professor Eric, I'm not even going to try to say his name, puts it, people are falling because technology is advancing so fast and our skills and our organizations aren't keeping up. The winner-take-all economy has set us up for what's coming, but rather than recognize the extent to which economic value is diverging more and more from human time and labor, we essentially keep pretending it's the 1970s. We've been able to get away with this pretense for a few decades by loading up on debt and cheap money and putting off future obligations. That has run its course just as technology is really set to take off and render more of our labor obsolete, particularly for normal Americans. You might be wondering at my choice of terminology in normal Americans. We'll explore that next. So in the next chapter, he's going to go into what he means by normal Americans, so I'm super excited to read about that. But that last little bit I thought was super on point, super interesting. And basically, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the politicians have been looking at the economy as if it was the 1970s. They have a worldview that reflects the world of the 1970s, which realistically that's just not the case anymore. We have things like, we have technology that's going to change the game completely, And you know, really the only reason we've been able to get away with this old school sense of thought is because we have had the Federal Reserve able to inject money into our system and sort of kind of create an artificial economy, so to speak. In reality though, we have to start thinking towards long-term solutions. So I'm super interested to get deeper into this book. Thank you guys so much for watching. Again, if you guys are interested, if anybody is interested in joining my book club for the 1%, The War on Normal People is the first book on the list, but I plan on diving into many different books and many different topics, and I would love to hear from you guys if you guys want to share your perspective. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.